If there is one position to get right in the NBA, it may well be the point guard. By the very nature of the position, this is someone who is consistently going to be handling the ball, taking it up the court, and creating opportunities not just for themselves, but for others as well. But as time has gone on, and as the NBA has evolved, we are now getting to a point of point guard inflation. We are going to get into defining that term, the causes of it, and what the implications of this is. Welcome back to State of the Association. I'm your host, Nash Roberts. Thank you very much for tuning in, and this is point guard inflation. Now, to begin, we must first define this term. And perhaps the best way to do so is by taking a look at the lower end of the spectrum, or at least the middle ground, these borderline starters. And perhaps the best example of this is Dennis Schroeder. Now, I want to take a second and think about what Schroeder is able to do internationally, because in the NBA, it is a whole different ballgame for him. But when he's playing for Germany, he is one of the best international players in the entire world. Whether it's in the World Cup or the Olympics, he always shows up and is the leader of a very successful era of Germany basketball. However, when we transition over to the NBA, he has been traded several times this NBA season. And ever since a long tenure with the Atlanta Hawks, in which he continually grew and developed as a player, he has not really managed to find a stable, consistent home for several years. Because he's good enough to be a starter, or at least a very good spark plug off of the bench, but he's not good enough to the extent in the eyes of most teams where they're not going to take a chance on some younger point guard or someone that they have hopes of developing or grabbing in free agency. And he finds himself in a different situation. He also gets to the point where he's a somewhat valuable trade asset that a team can get a little bit for as this very, very good role player, very solid point guard, but also an asset that teams are willing to trade. And in spite of his talent that he puts on display, at times he is often seen by teams as a little bit more disposable, replaceable, and that is because of point guard inflation, of which he is perhaps the best prime example of. Because this is a situation that a lot of other point guards can kind of resonate with and may have experienced themselves. You look at someone like D'Angelo Russell, who, even when he was an all-star caliber player, was not able to really find a home for more than a few years at a time. He had a little stretch on the Timberwolves, and then they decided to move on from him for not necessarily a point guard who is a definitive upgrade, a major, major blockbuster move in addition at the point guard position in Mike Conley, but instead someone who they felt better fit the team. And while D'Angelo Russell was talented, there are plenty of talented point guards in the NBA. And that's where this point guard inflation really comes in. No matter how talented you might be, if you are not consistently putting that on display and proving to your franchise why they should keep you, there's always going to be a replacement lurking in the shadows behind you. Dennis Schroeder, when he was on the Lakers, he had a very unfavorable playoff run. And the following year, the Lakers were more than ready to bring in Russell Westbrook to be their point guard instead. There's always someone gunning for your position. And with the rising level of talent in the NBA, being borderline is not enough for a lot of teams, because you take a look at an NBA general manager, for example, their livelihood comes in the face of success at their job. If the team is consistently underperforming and does not have a clear vision, that puts their job in jeopardy. So it is almost an easier decision to move on from your point guard in favor of trying out something new, because then that shows you're at least trying something. as opposed to becoming complacent and not really getting anywhere. And so, with the rise of talent in the NBA, where the league is perhaps more talented than ever before, especially as you go deeper and deeper into rosters and find more and more guys who can contribute, this rise of talent and the availability of only 32 starting point guard spots. Correction, 30, my bad. I don't know why I said 32. 30 point guard spots and maybe one or two off the bench for each team. There's not a lot of positions relative to the talent of the league. And especially that rings true at the point guard position. And that is where we get point guard inflation. And now we must establish why this is particularly true for the one guard as we get into the causes of this inflation. Now, I want to take you back to when Steph Curry was drafted into the NBA. And he dealt with some injuries early on, but outside of that, even on the court, there were questions about Curry, especially as a prospect, where for the longest time, the point guard position had been quite traditionalist, as we would perceive it now, in which the best of all time were guys like Magic Johnson or even a John Stockton, who were these past first players, and they were looking for a shot for themselves second. But ultimately, people remember the winners and they try to copy the winners so that they can get that formula for themselves. And Steph Curry, as a score first point guard who creates opportunities for others by his scoring gravity, would go on to be the leader of a Warriors dynasty that would win 4 NBA championships. And as the game evolved, of course, there was the 3-point revolution, but there was also the scoring guard revolution. Put yourself in the shoes of an NBA hopeful. Maybe even in college, you were somewhat of a pass first point guard your freshman year. But you take a look at the NBA, and all of a sudden that role seems to be dwindling out, and teams seem more and more to be favoring these shot first point guards. All of a sudden, you want to adapt to that. You want to become that shot first point guard because that is your ticket to the big leagues. And in regards to training as well, practicing your jump shot is very often more accessible than practicing your playmaking because sometimes you won't have teammates that are with you that you can set up and playmake for. But if you have a basketball hoop and you have yourself and you have a basketball, then you can work on your jumper all day. You don't need anyone else out there with you to practice your alley oops or your bounce passes. All you need is yourself to practice your jump shot. And so it became very easily accessible to train, especially if you had something like a shot machine, letting you stay in your position and rebounding the ball for you, as well as a prospect taking a look at the nature of the NBA and how it was evolving, and how everyone wants to get a piece of that pie of the scoring guard and the success that the Warriors had. We saw an influx of that archetype of PG. But as practicing your jumper becomes ever more apparent of how accessible it is, at the same time, there is a little bit of a drawback to the scoring guard, and this is where the inflation kind of comes in. Because by the very nature of the position, the point guard can be very volatile or inconsistent. This is someone who's often the central offensive hub for a team, and they're going to find themselves with the ball more often than not. And they're going to have the decision making skills to either choose to shoot the ball themselves or try to create for someone else. And they're also less likely to get a catch and shoot opportunity and instead are going to have to be the ones to create a shot. As a result, even if you're consistently getting shots up, which is something that if you're a very talented scoring guard, teams are already going to be trying to stop you from even getting comfortable shooting. Even if you get a lot of shots up, there's no guarantee that they're going in. Maybe they're heavily contested, for example, and you just can't make a lot of separation. You even kind of look at Luka Doncic, who has been impressive with the Lakers so far, but he has had some quite inefficient games, maybe a 6 for 20 game, for example. and he's one of the best point guards in the entire NBA. And even he at times deals with inconsistency from the nature of that point guard spot. Now imagine a lower caliber player who is going to be hitting those shots that uh, even a less consistent strip. And as this is happening, as inconsistencies occur naturally for the point guard, this by itself would not be a major problem. Ultimately, you can kind of cover up the weaknesses of a weaker guard. But with his accessibility of training to become a more shot first player and the demand for the scoring point guard, given the success that Golden State had, if you've got too many off nights, there's someone coming for you. And that is, in my opinion, the major cause behind point guard inflation. There's talent for sure, but with that talent, a lot of it is not necessarily uber dynamic. A lot of it is something that you either have to be very good at, or else someone younger is going to come in. And heck, they might not even be on the same level as you to start off their career. But what they're going to do is they might be 7 years younger. And teams are going to look at the potential of this player and decide that they want to develop him over an already finished product. So with the accessibility of turning your jumper, the demand for the scoring point guard, and that archetype not being uber sustainable, as well as the growing talent of the NBA, this leads to point guard inflation. But lastly, what happens? Why does all of this matter? And that is the career expectancy of the point guard, as well as the harsh reality of the NBA. Because now there is less margin for error than ever before. You have a couple off nights. Don't get too comfortable buying a home in Brooklyn. For a position like the small forward, for example, there's a lot of versatility in how you can play. You've got the likes of a LeBron James, this point forward. You've got the two-way players like a Kawhi Leonard or a Jaden McDaniels. You've got the score-first guys like a Durant when he would play small forward, or a Brandon Ingram. And while it's becoming more and more of a rarity, you even got the small forwards who specifically cater to defense. Think of a Lou Dort. Or even with Lou, you can talk about the archetype of the 3-and-D player. There are so many ways to affect the game as a small forward. There are so many versatile ways that you can play. And a lot of that comes down to the scheme of your team as well as your abilities. And so with that, there are opportunities for a lot of different play styles at that position. But for the point guard, their role is more so set in stone. They're going to have the ball in their hands quite frequently. They're going to be asked to score more than they might have back in the 80s. And if you're a high caliber enough offensive player, oftentimes your defense can kind of be glossed over and not really taken a thorough look at because of the way that you're able to impact the game in spite of your defense because of your offensive capabilities. It is an offensive focused role in which you are expected to create your shot for both yourself and others, while you've got people on the bench who have trained all their life to at least create a shot for themselves. And oftentimes, with that offensive load, you're not able to show what you might have had the potential to do defensively because it just doesn't fit within your team's game plan. They need you healthy and energized and ready to carry that ball on offense and be the leader of a possession. But with the lack of versatility and a more defined role of this position, that creates a minimal margin for error. I talked about how Steph Curry kind of led to the rise of the scoring guard, or at least the extent to which it is now. Before that, there was a little bit more versatility at that point guard position. You still had score first guys, but you also had more pass first traditional point guards. You had the defensive focused ones. But now the NBA leans more and more towards the scoring guards. And it's why it's so special to see someone like Drew Holiday be a two-time NBA champion. But the implications of this are the fact that somebody can do what you do as well. Because unlike the small forward in its versatility, where guys will do what best fits within a team and what best caters to their abilities, with the point guard, there's a lot less nuance in how you play the game. And with that, there's a lot of point guards who can do just what you do. And as a result of that, especially as you become an NBA veteran, it becomes harder and harder to maintain a spot in the league, and especially a starting position. Because unless you are the best of the best in a success-driven league, teams are going to be scouting. They're going to be looking for someone who can do your job just as well as you. And maybe they're younger. Maybe they've shown more raw potential and athleticism. If you are a borderline starter at the point guard position, it is harder than ever before to maintain that spot. The best of the best are always going to have their place in the league. The ones at the end of the rotation are typically always going to be on the outskirts of the league. But in that middle ground, where any display of inconsistencies or inefficiencies that cause a team to lose trust in you and lose confidence in you, that is where we see the biggest implications of point guard inflation. And that is all for today's episode of State of the Association. I'm your host, Nash Roberts. Thank you very much for listening.